Okay, so in this one, we're going to discuss Django settings, URLs, and views. I'm going to go through it kind of quickly, only because you just need a kind of overview of what's going on. Um, because when you actually start doing it, it will help kind of bring everything together for you. So if you remember from the last lecture, if you didn't watch it, it's okay. People go to a website. That website communicates with the server. The server sends something back. Django is on the server, as like where JavaScript and CSS is not on the server, it's on the browser. The browser interprets it. Django interprets other things like a URL request. But Django really handles the flow of data between the user and the server, or the browser and the server, or within the server. It doesn't always have to go back to the browser. Like, you don't always have to see what's going on, which is kind of nice. Now, when we want to start a Django project, this is what we do. This is the command for it. Django admin.py, start project, test project, or any project name. Test project could be anything you want to call it, as long as it's not something that conflicts with Django. Luckily, it will tell you that it conflicts with Django if you do that. So don't worry about doing this quite yet. We will do this in the actual class, so just kind of think of this as like an overview of the concepts. Manage.py handles a lot of the Django functions, the built-in functions from Django. We use that a lot, but we don't actually edit it very much. So you'll notice that these two folders are created with this. This is your main root project folder, and then this internal one is where your project will look for its settings, URLs. It looks for this stuff, basically. So settings is where you set up your default stuff. We'll go over that shortly. URLs is how Django manages what URL requests come through, which we'll go through shortly as well. Init and WSGI, we don't really need to cover right now because we don't actually touch it. We don't need to touch it. For advanced users, you can always look it up more and find that stuff out. But really, for the purposes of this, we use manage.py a lot, but we don't edit it. Settings.py, we kind of edit once, or we edit only a few times. URLs.py is similar. We only have to edit a few times. It's not critical that we have to edit it. But URLs.py, we edit a lot more often than we do settings.py. Because we typically add more functions and features, and URLs.py is how that happens. All right, so now jumping into settings, I said it's the defaults. It's like setting up your database, installed apps. We'll cover what that means, but basically it's kind of like, if you want to do analytics on your site, it should be its own app. So we have an app called Analytics, and then if you have a contact us page or form, sometimes you could have it as its own app. So you have it contact. If you have a shopping cart, it's its own app, cart, stuff like that. This is also where you're going to declare where your static files are. So like your CSS, your JavaScript, your HTML. Static files are typically things that are seen in the browser, not necessarily seen on the server, or needed to seen on the server. Static files, JavaScript is considered a static file, even though it helps with functionality within the browser. So just remember that this is where you'll set up the location of where these things are stored, and then also the administration info. So like if you're the super user or you're the owner of the site, this is where you'd put your email, and then you could also put an email for your webmaster or something like that, where if any errors or stuff like that happen, it will send it to you. Okay, so remember that we talked about URLs in the last one. If you don't, just think about how URLs look. This is typical URLs. You've seen these a lot. You've worked with URLs before, and when you share a link or something like that, you will see some type of pattern. For purpose of Django, every URL has a specific pattern that Django can understand. Now, this is the patterns that are associated to what we see here. Now, projects goes to that, projects /get with Mac, that goes with that. That's kind of how those patterns work. Django understands that this URL and its associated pattern probably means something. So those things go to a file called urls.py. Now this file tells Django and then the browser what to do with that specific pattern. So in the case of /admin, it's likely to go to some place called admin, right? With projects, it's going to go to some place called projects. But we need to figure out how it's going to go there first. So urls.py controls that. It controls where those requests go. So if you go to .com, it's going to go to Django. Django is going to go to urls.py. This happens almost instantaneously. And then urls.py contains a line like this. We'll see this a lot working through, but just keep it in mind. Now, we have our URL pattern, which is a regular expression for those of you who are a little bit more technical. And then that regular expression is related to this URL pattern that we just discussed, right? This one will then look for views.py, and it looks for an app, and looks for a view in that app, and then it looks for a function related to whatever it's calling right here. If this function doesn't exist, it's going to raise an error. Then we have this nickname home, or this name equal and home. It's basically a nickname. It's easier than writing out the full URL whenever you want to reference it in your Django files. Instead, you can use URL equals to some nickname. That's how you'll do it. We'll see that in action as well. But we're really going to discuss this part. So we have a URL pattern, and then we have it go to some view. But if you remember, when we started our project, it had no view. It doesn't have apps. It doesn't have anything. Right? So that's an app. That's a view. That's a definition of a function for how it's going to handle that view, right? So again, we don't see views.py at all when we started that project. So that means we have to create an app. Going back, apps control functions. It's best practice to have an app do one specific thing and do it well. So if you have a shopping cart in your site, you would want shopping cart to be its own app. If you have analytics, you want analytics to be its own app. Analytics can also be broken up into mini apps if you really wanted, if you had a lot of detail on analytics. You could also have an app specifically for products. So if you have a list of products, that could be an app. All of these things are just kind of best practices. You could always, of course, put it all into one app, but it's not recommended that you do that. It's much better that you put apps separate, just so it's easier to make changes and kind of understand what's going on for anyone that has never seen your project before but knows Django. So to make an app, this is what you do, one of these functions. We will do this a lot throughout the class, so you don't have to remember it. Your app just stands for some name that you want to give it. It could be cart, or it could be products, or whatever, or profiles, stuff like that. Within there, we have some files that are created. We're going to discuss models and views. Views, yay, we found our views. That is kind of what we saw here, remember? So for this one, it would be yourapp.views.home, right? Your app would be, instead of geolocator.views.home. And that would give you, that URL. But we still need that function, so we would have to open up views.py, because views handle what that URL request is after you declare them in the urls.py. So we need to create that function, home. So define is a standard Python declaration for a function, home, which is that, and then it's going to take in a request. So this URL thing passes a request. So that's our variable. And then we can do something with that request, or it can just render some template. In this case, we would return render to response, and then we have this template. So if you know just HTML and CSS, you could load it just there, and that's it. You don't have to do a whole lot of crazy stuff with Django or programming at all. This could just give you a URL pattern that resembles this. For some of you, this is actually very valuable, because if you know HTML and you know that a lot of times it's /index.html or /page2.html, you could do just URL patterns and views, and you can make your site look a little bit more user-friendly or shareable without that .html or .php or whatever. You can use that. Now, So just a little bit of a recap. Person comes to the website. That website is hosted by Django, so it looks for Django. Django then has an automatic settings file that then looks for settings like the database and all that stuff. But then it also looks for the urls.py. And urls.py then looks for the pattern that matches what was requested. That request is still like held onto. And then it looks for that pattern that's related, right? So those are equal. Then it passed that request into views.home or views.some function that you just declare. And then it goes into that file. And then that request comes through here, right? It goes through into that function, and then it handles that function. If you don't do anything and all you do is return this, that's okay. Basically, it needs a HTTP response, which render to response is one of those things. So it will render then a template. One more recap. Person goes through, sends it to Django. Django sends it to urls.py. urls.py sends it to an associated view. That view has a function that you declare, and that function has to return some type of HTTP response. That's it. All right, see you in the next one.